September 7th, 2499. Lake Pay Enclave. Continent of Haven. Safehold. Grandfather, come quickly. It's an angel. Timothy Harrison looked up as his great-grandson thundered unceremoniously through the open door of his town hall office. The boy's behavior was atrocious, of course, but it was never easy to be angry with Matthew, and no one Timothy knew could stay angry with him, which meant, boys being boys, the young Matthew routinely got away with things which ought to have earned a beating at the very least. In this case, however, he might be excused for his excitement, Timothy supposed, not that he was prepared to admit it. Matthew Paul Harrison, he said sternly, this is my office, not the shower house down at the baseball field. At least a modicum of proper behavior is expected out of anyone here, even, or especially, out of a young hooligan like you. I'm sorry, the boy replied, hanging his head, but he simultaneously peeped up through his eyelashes, and the dimples of the devastating smile which was going to get him into all sorts of trouble in another few years danced at the corners of his mouth. Well, Timothy harumphed, I suppose we can let it go without harping on it, this time. He had the satisfaction of noting what was probably a genuine quiver of trepidation at the qualifier. Then he leaned back in his chair. Now, what's this you were saying about an angel? The signal light, Matthew said eagerly, eyes lighting with bright excitement, as he recalled his original reason for intruding upon his grandfather. The signal light just began shining. Father Michael and I should run and tell you about it immediately. There's an angel coming, grandfather. And what color was the signal light? Timothy asked. His voice was so completely calm that without his realizing it, it raised him tremendously in his great-grandson's already high esteem. Yellow, Matthew replied, and Timothy nodded. One of the lesser angels, then. He felt a quick little stab of regret, for which he scolded himself instantly. It might be more exciting to hope to entertain a visit from one of the archangels themselves, but mortal men did well not to place commands upon God, even indirectly. Besides, even a lesser angel will be more than enough excitement for you, old man, he told himself scoldingly. Well, he said, nodding to his great-grandson, if an angel's coming to Lakeview, then we must make our preparations to receive him. Go down to the docks, Matthew. Find Jason and tell him to raise a signal for all the fishing boats to return to harbor. As soon as you've done that, go home and tell your mother and grandmother. I'm sure Father Michael will be ringing the bell shortly, but you might as well go ahead and warn them. Yes, grandfather, Matthew nodded eagerly, then turned and sped back the way he'd come. Timothy watched him go, smiling for a moment, then squared his shoulders and walked out of his office. Most of the town hall staff had paused in whatever they were doing. They were looking in his direction, and he smiled again, whimsically. I see you all heard Matthew's announcement, he said dryly. That being the case, I see no need to expand upon it further at this time. Finish whatever you were doing, file your work, and then hurry home to prepare yourselves. People nodded. Here and there, chairs scraped across the plank floor as clerks, who'd already anticipated his instructions, hurried to tuck files into appropriate cabinets. Others bent over their desks, quill pens flying as they worked towards a reasonable stopping point. Timothy watched them for a few seconds and then continued out the town hall's front door. The town hall stood upon a hill at the center of the town of Lakeview. Lakeview was growing steadily, and Timothy was aware that it wouldn't be long before it slipped over that elusive line dividing town from a small city. He wasn't certain how he felt about that, for a lot of reasons, but however he might feel about it, there was no doubt how God and the archangels felt, and that made any purely personal reservations on his part meaningless. Word was spreading, he saw. People were hurrying about the cobblestone streets and sidewalks, heads bent in excited conversation with companions or simply smiling hugely. The signal light on the steeple of Father Michael's church was deliberately placed to be visible by as much of the town as possible, and Timothy could see its bright amber glow from where he stood, despite the brightness of the summer sun. The bell in the church's high bell tower began to ring. Its deep, rolling voice sang through the summer air, crying out the joyous news for any who had not seen the signal light, and Timothy nodded around a bright, lilting bubble of happiness. Then he began walking towards the church himself, nodding calmly to the people he passed. He was, after all, Lakeview's mayor, which gave him a certain responsibility. More to the point, he was one of Lakeview's slowly but steadily declining number of atoms, just as his wife Sarah was one of the town's Eves. That left both of them with a special duty to maintain the proper air of dignified respect, adoration, and awe due one of the immortal servants of the God who had breathed the very breath of life into their nostrils. He reached the church, and Father Michael was waiting for him. The priest was actually younger than Timothy, but he looked much older. Michael had been one of the very first of the children brought forth here upon Safehold in response to God's command to be fruitful and multiply. Timothy himself had not been born at all, of course. God had created his immortal soul with his own hand, and the Archangel Langhorn and his assistant, the Archangel Shanwei, had created Timothy's physical body according to God's plan. Timothy had awakened right here in Lakeview, standing with the other Adams and Eves in the town square, and the mere memory of that first glorious morning, that first sight of Safehold's magnificent blue heavens and brilliant light of Kaozi as it broke the eastern horizon like a dripping orb of molten copper, of the towering green trees, the fields already tilled and rich with awaiting harvest, the dark blue waters of Lake Pay, and the fishing boats tied up and waiting at the docks, still filled his soul with reverential awe. It was the first time he'd ever laid eyes upon his Sarah, for that matter, and that had been a miracle all its own. But that had been almost 65 years ago. Had he been as other men born of the union of man and woman, his body would have begun failing long since. Indeed, although he was 4 years older than Father Michael, the priest was stoop-shouldered and silver-haired, his fingers beginning to gnarl with age, while Timothy's hair remained dark and thick, untouched by white, although there were a few strands of silver threading their way into his beard here and there. Timothy remembered when Father Michael had been red-faced, wailing babe in his mother's arms. Timothy himself had already been a man full grown, a man in the prime of early manhood, as all Adams had been at the awakening. And being what he was, the direct work of divine hands, it was to be expected that his life would be longer than the lives of those further removed from the direct touch of the Godhead. But if Michael resented that in any way, Timothy had never seen a single sign of it. The priest was a humble man, ever mindful that to be permitted his priestly office was a direct and tangible sign of God's grace, that grace of which no man could ever truly be worthy, which did not absolve him from attempting to be. "Rejoice, Timothy," the priest said now, eyes glowing under his thick white eyebrows. "Rejoice, Father," Timothy responded, and went down on one knee briefly for Michael to lay a hand upon his head and bless him. "May Langhorn bless and keep you always in God's ways and laws until the day awaited comes to us all," Michael murmured rapidly, then tapped Timothy lightly on the shoulder. "Now get up," he commanded. "You're the Adam here, Timothy. Tell me I shouldn't feel this nervous." "You shouldn't feel this nervous," Timothy said obediently, rising to put one arm around his old friend's shoulders. "Truly," he added in a more serious tone, "you've done well, Michael. Your flock's been well tended since the last visitation, and it's increased steadily." "Our flock, you mean," Father Michael replied. Timothy started to shake his head, then suppressed the gesture. It was kind of Michael to put it that way, but both of them knew that however conscientiously Timothy had sought to discharge his responsibilities as the administrator of Lakeview and the surrounding farms, all of his authority ultimately stemmed from the archangels, and through them from God himself, which meant that here in Lakeview, the ultimate authority in any matter, spiritual or worldly, lay with Father Michael as a representative of Mother Church. "But it's like him to put it that way, isn't it?" Timothy thought with a smile. "Come," he said aloud, "from the pattern of the signal light, it won't be long now. We have preparations to make." By the time the glowing nimbus of the Keosi High appeared far out over the blue waters of Lake Pay, all was ready. The entire population of Lakeview, aside from a few fishermen who'd been too far out on the enormous lake to see the signal to return, was assembled in and around the town square. The families from several of the nearer farms had arrived as well, and Lakeview Square was no longer remotely large enough to contain them all. They overflowed its bounds, filling the approach streets solidly, and Timothy Harrison felt a deep, satisfying surge of joy at the evidence that he and his fellow Adams and Eves had indeed been fruitful and multiplied. The Keosi High sped nearer, faster than the fastest horse could gallop, faster than the fastest slash lizard could charge. The globe of light grew brighter and brighter as it swept closer to the town. At first it was only a brilliant speck, far out over the lake. Then it grew larger and brighter. It became a star, fallen from the vault of God's own heaven. Then brighter still, a second sun, smaller than Kaizi, but brilliant enough to challenge even the blinding brightness. And then, as it flashed across the last few miles, swift as any stooping wyvern, its brilliance totally surpassed that of any mere sun. It blazed above the town without heat and yet far too bright for any eye to bear, etching shadows with knife-edged sharpness despite the noonday sun. Timothy, like every other man and woman, bent his head, shielding his eyes against that blinding glory, and then the brilliance decreased as rapidly it had come, and he raised his head slowly. The Cayuse High was still above Lake View, but it had risen so high into the heavens that it was once more a little brighter than Cauzy. Still far too brilliant to look upon, yet far enough removed that merely mortal flesh could endure its presence. But if the Cayuse High had withdrawn, the being whose chariot it was had not. All across the town square, people went to their knees in reverence and awe, and Timothy did the same. His heart sang with joy as he beheld the angel standing on the raised platform at the very center of the square. That platform was reserved solely and only for moments like this. No mortal human foot could be permitted to profane its surface, other than those of the consecrated priesthood responsible for ritually cleansing it and maintaining it in permanent readiness for moments like this. Timothy recognized the angel. It had been almost 2 years since the last visitation, and the angel hadn't changed since his last appearance in Lakeview. He did have the appearance of having aged, slightly at least, since the first time Timothy had ever seen him, immediately after the awakening. But then, the writ said that although the angels and archangels were immortal, the bodies they had been given to teach and guide God's people were made of the same stuff as mortal world. Animated by the Sergoi Kasei, the great fire of God's own touch, those bodies would endure longer than any mortal body, just as the bodies of Adam's and Eve's would endure longer than those of their descendants. But they would age. Indeed, the day would ultimately come when all of the angels, even the archangels themselves, would be recalled to God's presence. Timothy knew God himself had ordained that, yet he was deeply grateful that he himself would have closed his eyes in death before that day arrived. A world no longer inhabited by angels would seem dark, shadowed, and drab to one who'd seen God's own messengers face to face in the glory of that world's very first days. In many ways, the angel looked a little different from a mortal. He was no taller than Timothy, his shoulders no broader, yet he was garbed from head to foot in brilliant, light-shimmering raiment, a marvelous garment of perpetually shifting and flowing colors, and his head was crowned by a crackling blue fire. At his waist he bore his staff, the rod of imperishable crystal, half as long as a man's forearm. Timothy had seen that rod used only once, but its lightning bolt had smitten the charging slash lizard to the earth in a single cataclysmic thunderclap of sound. Half the slash lizard's body had been literally burned away, and Timothy's ears had rung for hours afterwards. The angel looked out across the reverently kneeling crowd for several seconds in silence. Then he raised his right hand. "Peace be with you, my children," he said, his voice impossibly clear and loud, yet not shouting, not raised. "I bring you God's blessing and the blessing of the Archangel Langhorn, who is his servant. Glory be to God." And to his servants the response rumbled back, and the angel smiled. "God is pleased with you, my children," he told them. "And now go about your business, all of you, rejoicing in the Lord. I bring tidings to Father Michael and Mayor Timothy. After I have spoken with them, they will tell you what God desires of you." Timothy and Michael stood side by side, watching as the crowded square, surrounding streets emptied, quickly, and yet without hurrying or pushing. Some of the farmers from outside town had ridden hard, or in some cases literally run for miles, to be here for the moment of the angel's arrival. Yet there was no resentment, no disappointment in being sent about their business once again so quickly. It had been their joyous duty to welcome God's messenger, and they knew they had been blessed beyond the deserts of any fallible, sinful mortal to have beheld the angel with their own eyes. The angel descended from the consecrated platform across to Timothy and Michael. They went to one knee again before him, and he shook his head. "No, my sons," he said gently. "There will be time enough for that. For now we must speak. God and the Archangel Langhorn are pleased with you, pleased with the way in which Lakeview has grown and prospered. But you may be called to face new challenges, and the Archangel Langhorn has charged me to strengthen your spirits for the task to which you may be summoned. Come, let us go into the church where we may speak in proper setting." Pei Kai-young sat in the comfortable chair, his face expressionless masked as he listened to the debate. The G6 sun they had named Kao Zi in honor of his brother shone down outside. It was just past local noon. and the northern summer was hot, but a cool breeze off Lake Pei blew in through the open windows, and he grimaced mentally as it breathed gently across him. Bastards couldn't heap enough honors on us, could they? Named the local sun after Kaizi, the lake after him too, I suppose. Or maybe they meant to name it after both of us. Maybe even Shanway at the time. But that's as far as they're going to go. I wonder if Mission Control picked Langhorne and Bedard because the planners knew they were megalomaniacs. He tried to tell himself that was only because of the weariness, almost 60 standard years, almost 65 local years, of watching the two of them in operation had made inevitable. Unfortunately, he couldn't quite shake the thought that the people who'd selected Eric Langhorne as the colony's chief administrator and Dr. Adory Bedard as his chief psychologist had known exactly what they were doing. After all, the survival of the human race, at any cost, was far more important than any minor abridgments of basic human rights. And we implore you once again, the slender, silver-haired woman standing in the corner of the breezy hearing room said, to consider how vital it is that the human culture on this planet grows and matures. It remembers the Gababa, that it understands why we came here, why we renounced advanced technology. Kai Young regarded her with stony brown eyes. She didn't even look in his direction, and he felt one or two of the counselors glancing at him with what they fondly imagined was hidden sympathy, or, in some cases, concealed amusement. We've heard all these arguments before, Dr. Pai, Eric Langhorne said. We understand the point you're raising, but I'm afraid that nothing you've said is likely to change our established policy. Administrator, Pei Shanwei said, your established policy overlooks the fact that mankind has always been a tool maker and a problem solver. Eventually, those qualities are going to surface here on Safehold. When they do, without an institutional memory of what happened to the Federation, our descendants aren't going to know what the dangers are waiting for them out there. That particular concern is based on faulty understanding of the societal matrix we're creating here, Dr. Pei, Adory Bedard said. I assure you, with the safeguards we've put in place, the inhabitants of Safehold will be safely insulated against the sort of technological advancement which might attract the Gababa's attention. Unless, of course, the psychiatrist's eyes narrowed, there's some outside stimulus to violate the parameters of our matrix. I don't doubt that you have already created an anti-technology mindset on an individual and societal level, Shanwei replied. Her own voice was level, but it didn't take someone with Bedard's psychological training to hear the distaste and personal antipathy under its surface. I simply believe that whatever you can accomplish right now, whatever curbs and safeguards you can impose at this moment, 500 years from now, or 1,000, there's going to come a moment when those safeguards fail. They won't, Bedard said flatly. Then she made herself sit back a bit from the table and smile. I realize psychology isn't your field, Doctor, and I also realize one of your doctorates is in history. Because it is, you're quite rightly aware of the frenetic pace at which technology has advanced in the modern era. Certainly on the basis of humanity's history on old Earth, especially during the last 5 or 6 centuries. It would appear the innovation bug is hardwired into the human psyche. It isn't, however. There are examples from our own history of lengthy, very static periods. In particular, I draw your attention to the thousands of years of the Egyptian Empire, during which significant innovation basically didn't happen. What we've done here on Safehold is to recreate that same basic mindset, and we've also installed certain institutional and physical checks to maintain that mindset. The degree to which the Egyptians and the rest of the Mediterranean cultures were anti-innovation has been considerably overstated, Shanwei said coolly. Moreover, Egypt was only a tiny segment of the total world population of its day, and other parts of that total population most definitely were innovative. And despite the effort to impose permanent theocratic curb on... Dr. Pei, Langhorne interrupted. I'm afraid this entire discussion is pointless. The colony's policy has been thoroughly debated and approved by the Administrative Council. It represents the consensus of that council, and also that of myself as Chief Administrator and Dr. Bedard as Chief Psychologist. It will be adhered to by everyone. Is that clear? It must have been hard for Shanwei not to even look in his direction, Kai Young thought, but she didn't. For 57 years, the two of them had lived apart, divided by their bitter public disagreement over the colony's future. Kai Young was one of the moderates, the group that might not agree with everything Langhorne and Bedard had done, but which fervently supported the ban on anything which might lead to the reemergence of advanced technology. Kai Jung himself had occasionally voiced concern over the degree to which Bedard had adjusted the originally proposed psych templates for the colonists, but he'd always supported Langhorne's basic reasons for modifying them, which was why he remained the colony's senior military officer, despite his estranged wife's position as the leader of the faction whose opponents had labeled them techies. "With all due respect, Administrator Langhorne," Shanway said, "I don't believe your policy does represent a true consensus. I was a member of the council myself, if you'll recall, as were 6 of my colleagues on the present Alexandria board. All of us opposed your policy when you first proposed it," which, Kai Jung thought, split the vote 8-7, too short of the supermajority you needed under the colonial charter to modify the templates, didn't it, Eric? Of course, you'd already gone ahead and done it, which left you with a teeny tiny problem. That's why Shanway and the others found themselves arbitrarily removed from the council, wasn't it? "That's true," Langhorne said coldly. "However, none of you are current members of the council, and the present council membership unanimously endorses this policy. And whatever other ancient history you might wish to bring up, I repeat that the policy will stand and it will be enforced throughout the entire colony, which includes your so-called Alexandria enclave. And if we choose not to abide by it," Shanway's voice was soft, but spines stiffened throughout the hearing room. Despite the decades of increasingly acrimonious debate, it was the first time any of the techies had publicly suggested the possibility of active resistance. "That would be unwise of you," Langhorne said after a moment, glancing sidelong at Kai Jung. "To date, this has been simply a matter of public debate of policy issues. Now that the policy has been set, however, active noncompliance becomes treason, and I warn you, Dr. Pai, that when the stakes are the survival or extinction of the human race, we're prepared to take whatever measures seem necessary to suppress treason." "I see." Pei Shanway's head turned as she slowly swept all the seated counselors with icy brown eyes so dark they were almost black. They looked even darker today, Kai Jung thought, and her expression was bleak. "I'll report the outcome of this meeting to the rest of the board, Administrator," she said finally, her voice an icicle. "I'll also inform them that we are required to comply with your official policy under threat of physical coercion. I'm sure the board will have a response for you as soon as possible." She turned and walked out of the hearing room without a single backward glance. Pei Kai Jung sat in another chair, this one on a dock extending into the enormous, dark blue waters of Lake Pei. A fishing pole had been set into the holding bracket beside his chair, but there was no bait on the hook. It was simply a convenient prop to help keep people away. "We knew it could come to this, or something like it," he told himself. Call Z, Shanway, Nemu, me, Proctor, we all knew, from the moment Langhorne was chosen instead of Halverson, and now it has. There were times when, anti-Jerome treatments or not, he felt every single day of his 190 standard years. He tipped further back in his chair, looking up through the darkened blue of the approaching evening, and saw the slowly moving silver star of the orbiting starship, TFNS Hamilcar, the final surviving unit of the 46 mammoth ships which had delivered the colony to Kaizu. The gargantuan task of transporting millions of colonists to a new home world would have been impossible without the massive employment of advanced technologies. That had been a given, and yet it had almost certainly been the betraying emissions of that same technology which had led to the discovery and the destruction of the only other colony fleet to break through the Gababa blockade. So Operation Ark's planners had done 2 things differently. First, Operation Ark's mission plan had required the colony fleet to remain in Hyper for a minimum of 10 years before even beginning to search for a new homeworld. That had carried it literally thousands of light years from the Federation, far enough that it would take even the Gababa scouting fleet centuries to sweep the thicket of stars in which it had lost itself. Second, the colony had been provided with not 1, but 2 complete terraforming fleets. One had been detached and assigned to the preparation of safehold, while the other remained in close company with the transports hiding far from Call Z as backup. If the Gababa had detected the ships eventually laboring on safehold, they would undoubtedly have been destroyed, but their destruction would not have led the Gababa to the rest of the fleet. which would then have voyaged onward for another 10 years on a totally random vector before once more searching for a new home. Hamilcar had been with that hidden fleet, a flagship of Operation Ark's civilian administration, and she'd been retained this long because the basic plan for Operation Ark had always envisioned a requirement for at least some technological presence until the colony was fully established. The enormous transport, half again the size of the Federation's largest dreadnought, was at minimal power levels, with every one of her multiply redundant stealth systems operating at all times. A Gababa scout ship could have been in orbit with her without detecting her, unless it closed to within 200 or 300 kilometers. Even so, and despite her enormous value as administrative center, orbiting observatory, and emergency industrial module, her time was running out. That was what had prompted the confrontation between Shanway and Langhorne and Bedard this afternoon. The safehold colonial enclaves had been up and running for almost 60 standard years, and Langhorne and his council had decided it was finally time to dispose of all the expedition's remaining technology, or almost all of it, at any rate. Hamilcar's sister ships were already long gone. They'd been discarded as quickly as possible by the simple expedient of dropping them into the star system's central fusion furnace once their cargoes had been landed. Not that those cargoes had been used exactly as Mission Control had originally envisioned, thanks to Bedard's modifications to the site templates. A deep, fundamental part of Pai Kai-Jung had felt a shudder of dismay when Mission Control first briefed him and his brother on everything involved in Operation Ark. Not even the fact that every one of the cryogenically suspended colonists had been a fully informed volunteer had been enough to overcome his historical memory of his own ancestors' efforts at thought control. And yet he'd been forced to concede that there was an element of logic behind the decision to implant every colonist with what amounted to the detailed memory of a completely false life. It almost certainly would have proved impossible to convince 8 million citizens of a highly developed technological civilization to renounce all advanced technology when it came down to it. No matter how willing they all were before they set out for their new home, no matter how fit, young, and physically vigorous they might be, the reality of a muscle-powered culture, harsh demands would have convinced at least some of them to change their minds. So Mission Control had decided to preclude that possibility by providing them with memories which no longer included advanced technology. It hadn't been an easy task, even for the Federation's tech base, but however much Kai-Jung might despise Adari Bedard, he had to admit the woman's technical brilliance. The colonists had been stacked like cardwood in their cryo capsules, as many as 500,000 of them aboard a single ship. In the case of really large transports, like Hamilcar, and they'd spent the entire 10-year voyage with their minds being steadily reprogrammed. Then they'd stayed in cryo for another 8 standard years, safely tucked away in hiding, while the far less numerous active mission team personnel located their new home world and the Alpha terraforming crew prepared it for them. The world they'd named Safehold was a bit smaller than Old Earth. Kal Z was considerably cooler than Sol, and although Safehold orbited closer to it, the planet had a noticeably lower average temperature than Old Earth. Its axial tilt was a bit more pronounced as well, which gave it somewhat greater seasonal shifts as a result. It also had a higher proportion of land area, but that land was broken up into numerous smallish mountainous continents and large islands that helped to moderate the planetary climate at least a little. Despite its marginally smaller size, Safehold was also a bit more dense than mankind's original home. As a result, its gravity was very nearly the same as the one in which the human race had initially evolved. Its days were longer, but its years were shorter, only a bit more than 301 local days each, and the colonists had divided it into only 10 months, each of 6 5-day weeks. The local calendar still felt odd to Kai-Jung. He supposed it made sense, but he missed January and December, damn it. And he'd had more trouble than he expected adjusting to the long days, but overall, it was one of the more pleasant planets mankind had settled upon. Despite all of its positive points, there had been a few drawbacks, of course. There always were. In this case, the native predators, especially the aquatic ones, presented exceptional challenges, and an ecosystem in general had proved rather less accommodating than usual to the necessary terrestrial plant and animal strains required to fit the planet for human habitation. Fortunately, among the units assigned to each terraforming task group, Mission Control had included a highly capable bio support ship whose geneticists were able to make the necessary alterations to adapt terrestrial life to safehold. Despite that, those terrestrial life forms remain interlopers. The genetic modifications had helped, but they couldn't completely cure the problem, and for the first few years, the success of Safehold's terraforming had hung in the balance. That had been when Langhorne and Bedard needed Shanwei, Kai Jung thought bitterly. She'd headed the terraforming teams, and it was her leadership which carried the task through to success. She and her people, watched over by Kai Jung's flagship, TFNS Gulliver, had battled the planet into submission while most of the colony fleet had waited motionless, holding station in the depths of interstellar space, light years from the nearest star. Those have been heady days, Kai Jung admitted to himself, days when he felt he and Shanwei and their crews were genuinely forging ahead, although that confidence had been shadowed by the constant fear that the Gababa scout ship might happen by while they hung in orbit around the planet. They'd known the odds were overwhelmingly in their favor, yet they'd been too agonizingly aware of the stakes for which they played to take any comfort from the odds. Despite all the precautions mission planning had built in, but they'd still had that sense of purpose, of wresting survival from the jaws of destruction, and he remembered their huge sense of triumph on the day they realized they'd finally turned the corner and sent word to Hamilcar the Safehold was ready for its new inhabitants. And that was the point at which they discovered how Bedard had modified the sleeping colonist. Psychological templates. No doubt she thought it was a vast improvement when Langhorne initially suggested it, but Kai Jung and Shanwei had been horrified. The sleeping colonists had volunteered to have false memories of a false life implanted. They hadn't volunteered to be programmed to believe Operation Ark's command staff were gods. It wasn't the only change Langhorne had made, of course. He and Bedard had done their systematic best to preclude the possibility of any reemergence of advanced technology on Safehold. They deliberately abandoned the metric system, which Kai Jung suspected had represented a personal prejudice on Langhorne's part, but they'd also eliminated any memory of Arabic numerals or algebra, in a move calculated to emasculate any development of advanced mathematics, just as they had eliminated any reference to the scientific method and reinstituted a Ptolemaic theory of the universe. They'd systematically destroyed the tools of scientific inquiry, then concocted their religion as a means of ensuring that it never reemerged once more, and nothing could have been better calculated to outrage someone with Shanwei's passionate belief in freedom of the individual and of thought. Unfortunately, it had been too late to do anything about it. Shanwei and her allies on the Administrative Council had tried, but they quickly discovered that Langhorne was prepared for their resistance. He'd organized his own clique, with judicious transfers and replacements among the main fleet's command personnel, while Shanwei and Kai Jung were safely out of the way, and those changes had been enough to defeat Shanwei's best efforts, which was why Kai Jung and Shanwei had their very public falling out. It had been the only way they could think of to organize some sort of open resistance to Langhorne's policies while simultaneously retaining a presence in the heart of the colony's official command structure. Shanwei's reputation, her leadership of the minority bloc on the Administrative Council, would have made it impossible for anyone to believe she supported the administrator, and so their roles had been established for them. They drifted further and further apart, settled into deeper and deeper estrangement. And all for nothing in the end. He'd given up the woman he loved. Both of them had given up the children they might yet have reared, sacrificed 57 years of their lives to a public pretense of anger and violent disagreement for nothing. Shanwei and the other techies, just under 30% of the original Operation Ark command crew, had retired to Safehold's southernmost continent. They built their own enclave, their Alexandria enclave, taking the name deliberately from the famous library at Alexandria, and rigorously adhered to the original mission orders where technology was concerned. And, even more unforgivably, from the perspective of Langhorne and Bedard's new plans, they refused to destroy their libraries. They insisted on preserving the true history of the human race, and especially of their war against the Gababa. That's what really sticks in your craw, isn't it, Eric? Kai Jung thought. You know, there's no risk of the Gababa detecting the sort of pre-electric technology Shanwei still has up and running at Alexandria. Hell, any one of the air cars you're still willing to allow your command staff personnel to use as their angelic chariots radiates a bigger, stronger signal than everything at Alexandria combined. You may say that any indigenous technology, even the memory of that sort of tech, represents the threat of touching off more advanced, more readily detectable development, but that's not what really bothers you. You've decided you like being a god, so you can't tolerate any heretical scripture, can you? Kai Young didn't know how Langhorne would respond to Shan Wei's threats of open defiance. Despite his own position as Safehold's military commander, he knew he wasn't completely trusted by the administrator and the sycophants on Langhorne's administrative council. He wasn't one of them, despite his long-standing estrangement from Shan Wei, and too many of them seemed to have come to believe they truly were the deities Bedard had programmed the colonists to think they were. The people who think they're gods aren't likely to exercise a lot of restraint when someone defies them, he thought. Pai Kayung watched Hamilcar's distant, gleaming dot sweep toward the horizon and tried not to shiver as the evening breeze grew colder. "Father! Father!" Timothy Harrison muttered something from the borderland of sleep, and the hand on his shoulder shook him again harder. "Wake up, Father!" Timothy's eyes opened and he blinked. His third-born son, Robert, Matthew's grandfather, stood leaning over the bed with a candle burning in one hand. For a moment, Timothy was only bewildered, but then Robert's shadowed expression registered, despite the strange lighting falling across it from below as the candle quivered in his hand. "What is it?" Timothy asked, sitting up in bed. Beside him, Sarah stirred, then opened her own eyes and sat up. He felt her welcome, beloved presence warm against his shoulder, and his right hand reached out, finding and clasping hers as if by instinct. "I don't know, Father," Robert said worriedly, and in that moment Timothy was once again reminded that his son looked far older than he himself did. "All I know," Robert continued, "is that a messenger's arrived from Father Michael. He says you're needed at the church immediately." Timothy's eyes narrowed. He turned and looked at Sarah for a moment, and she gazed back. Then she shook her head and reached out with her free hand to touch his cheek gently. He smiled at her as calmly as he could, though she was undoubtedly the last person in the world he could really hope to fool, then looked back at Robert. "Is the messenger still here?" "Yes, Father." "Does he know when Michael needs me?" "He says he doesn't, Father, and I don't think it was just a way to tell me to mind my own business. In that case, ask him to return immediately. Ask him to tell Father Michael I'll be there just as quickly as I can get dressed." "At once, Father," Robert said, not even attempting to hide his relief as his father took charge. "Michael?" Timothy paused just inside the church doors. The church, as always, was softly illuminated by the red glow of the presence lights. The magnificent mosaic of ceramic tiles and semi-precious stones which formed the wall behind the high altar was more brightly illuminated by the cut crystal lamps, which were kept filled with only the purest oil from freshwater kraken. The huge, lordly faces of the Archangel Langhorne and the Archangel Bedard gazed out from the mosaic, their noble eyes watching Timothy as he stood inside the doors. The weight of those eyes always made Timothy aware of his own mortality, his own fallibility before the divinity of God's chosen servants. Usually, it also filled him with reassurance, the renewed faith that God's purpose in creating Safehold as a refuge and a home for mankind must succeed in the end. But tonight, for some reason, he felt a chill instead. No doubt it was simply the unprecedented nature of Michael's summons, but it also seemed as if shadows moved across the archangels' faces despite the unwavering flame of the lights. "Timothy!" Father Michael's voice pulled Timothy away from that disturbing thought. Then he looked up as Michael appeared in the side door just off the sanctuary. "What is this all about, Michael?" Timothy asked. He paused to genuflect before the mosaic, then rose, touching the fingers of his right hand to his heart, then to his lips, and strode down the central aisle. He knew he'd sounded sharp, abrupt, and he tried to smooth his own voice, but the irregularity, especially so soon after the visitation, had him on edge and anxious. "I'm sorry to have summoned you this way," Father Michael said, "but I had no choice. I have terrible news. Terrible news." He shook his head. "Worst news I could possibly imagine." Timothy's heart seemed to stop for just an instant as the horror in Michael's voice registered. He froze in mid-stride, then made himself continue toward the priest. "What sort of news, Michael?" he asked more gently. "Come." It was all the priest said, and he stepped back through the door. It led to the sacristy. Timothy realized as he followed, but Michael continued through another door on the sacristy's far side. A narrow flight of stairs led upward, and the priest didn't even pause for a candle or taper as he led Timothy up them. The stairs wound upward, and Timothy quickly recognized them, although it was over 40 years since he had last climbed them himself. They led up the tall, rectangular bell tower to the huge bronze bells perched under the pointed steeple at the very top. Timothy was panting by the time they reached the top, and Michael was literally stumbling with exhaustion from the pace he'd set, but he still didn't speak, nor did he pause. He only put his shoulder under the trapdoor, heaved it up, and clambered through it. A strange, dim radiance spilled down through the open trapdoor. Timothy hesitated for just a moment. Then he stilled his nerve, reached for his faith. He followed his friend and priest to the trapdoor, and the radiance strengthened as the one who had awaited them turned toward him, and the power of his presence reached out. "Peace be with you, my son," the angel said. 15 minutes later, Timothy Harrison found himself staring at an angel with the one expression he had never expected to show one of God's servants, one of horror. "And so, my children," the angel said, his own expression grave, "although I warned you only days before that new challenges might await you, not even I expected this." He shook his head sorrowfully, and yet it would not have been impetuous. Timothy would have called the angel's expression as much worried as grave. Perhaps it is, Mayer thought. And why shouldn't it be? Not even angels, not even archangels, are gods and are God themselves. And to have something like this happen is a sad and terrible duty to bring you this word, these commands, the angel said sadly. When God created Safehold for your home, the place for you to learn and know Him and serve His will, it is our duty to keep it safe from evil, and now we've failed. It is not your fault, but ours, and we shall do all in our power to amend it. Yet it is possible the struggle will be severe. In the end, we must triumph, for it is we who will remain loyal to God's will, and He will not suffer His champions to fail. But a price may yet be demanded of us for our failure. But that's not, Timothy began, then closed his mouth firmly as the angel looked at him with a small smile. "Not fair, my son?" he said gently. Timothy stared at him, unable to speak again. The angel shook his head. "The archangel Shanwei has fallen, my sons, and we did not keep the watch we ought to have kept. Her actions should not have taken us by surprise, but they have, for we trusted her as one of our own. She was one of our own. But now she has betrayed us as she has betrayed herself. She has turned to the darkness, brought evil into God's world through her own vaunting ambition, blind in her madness to the sure and certain knowledge that no one, not even an archangel, may set his will against God's and triumph. Maddened by her taste for power, no longer content to serve, she demanded the power to rule, to remake this world as she would have it, not as God's plan decrees. And when the archangel Langhorn refused her demands and rebuffed her mad ambition, she raised impious war against him. Many lesser angels and even some other archangels seduced her banner, gathered with her, and not content to damn their own souls, they beguiled and misled many of their mortal flock to follow in their own sinful path. But what shall we do?" Father Michael asked, in a voice which scarcely even quavered. Timothy noted. But was that because the priest had found his courage once again? Because the enormity of the sin the angel had described was simply too vast for him to fully take in? "You must be prepared to weather days of darkness, my son," the angel said. "The sorrow that she who was one of the brightest among us should have fallen so low will be a hard thing for your flock to understand. There may be those among that flock who require reassurance, but you must also be vigilant. Some even among your own may have been secretly seduced by Shanwei's minions. They must be guarded against. It is even possible that other angels may come here, claiming visitation in Langhorn's name, when in fact they serve Shanwei." "Forgive me," Timothy said humbly, "but we're only mortals. How shall we know who an angel truly serves?" "That is a just question, my son," the angel said, his expression troubled. "And, in honesty, I do not know if it will be possible for you to tell. I'm charged by the Archangel Langhorn, however, to tell you that if you question the instructions you are given by any angel in his name, he will forgive you if you hesitate to obey them until you have requested their confirmation from me, who you know serves his will, and God's still." And the angel's expression hardened into one of anger and determination, almost hatred, such as Timothy had never expected to see upon it. There will not be many such angels. The Archangel Langhorn's wrath has already been loosed with God's holy fire behind it, and no servant of darkness can stand against the light. There is war in Safehold, my children, and until it is resolved, you must... The angel stopped speaking abruptly, and Timothy and Father Michael wheeled towards the open side of the belfry as a brilliant, blinding light flashed upon the northern horizon. It was far away, possibly all the way on the far shore of the enormous lake, but despite the vast distance, it's also incredibly bright. It split the darkness, reflecting across the lake's waters as if they were a mirror, and as it blazed, it rose higher and higher like some flaming mushroom rising against the night. The angel stared at it, and was probably just as well that neither Timothy nor the priest could tear his own eyes away from that glaring beacon to see the shock and horror on the angel's expression. But then, as the column of distant flame reached its maximum height and began slowly to dim, the angel found his voice once more. "My children," he said, and if the words weren't quite steady, neither of the two mortals with him was any shape to notice it. "I must go. The war of which I spoke has come closer than we expected. The Archangel Langhorn needs all of us, and I go to join him in battle. Remember what I've told you, and be vigilant." He looked at them one more time and then stepped through the belfry opening. Any mortal would have plunged to the ground, undoubtedly shattering his body in the process, but the angel did not. Instead, he rose quickly, silently into the blackness, and Timothy summoned the courage to lean out and look up after him. A brilliant dot blossomed far above as he looked, and he realized that the angel's Keyosi Hai had lifted him up. "Timothy?" Michael's voice was soft, almost tiny, and he looked imploringly at the mayor, then back to the distant glare still fading on the horizon. "I don't know, Michael," Timothy said quietly. He turned back to the priest and put his arm about him. "All we can do is place our faith in God and the archangels. That much I understand. But after that," he shook his head slowly, "after that, I just don't know."